All right, so we're 100 pages into this thing, and it's a 400-page book. I think it's doable. I think we can do this, even though we cheated and skipped one chapter on the meaning of numbers. I had a funny synchronicity though today. I went to go get a repair on my car to go get an estimate for it, and I was dismayed to hear that it would cost $428. I was like, shit, I don't have $428. So anyway, so I come back, and as I'm looking through Spengler here, I noticed that volume 1 is exactly 428 pages. So I'm taking that as confirmation that I'm on the right path, even though I can't afford the fucking repair. I'm on the right path, so we'll get through this. It's going to happen. I think we can finish this chapter in this video, and then move on from here. We're on subsection 6, where he says, "And now it is possible to discover the ultimate elements of the historical form world. Countless shapes that emerge and vanish, pile up and melt again, a thousand-hued, glittering tumult, it seems, of perfectly willful chance, such is the picture of world history when first it deploys before our inner eye. But through this seeming anarchy, the keener glance can detect those pure forms which underlie all human becoming, penetrate their cloud mantle, and bring them unwillingly to unveil. But of the whole picture of world becoming, of that cumulus of grand planes that the Faust eye sees piled one beyond another, the becoming of the heavens, of the earth's crusts, of life, of man, we shall deal here only with that very small morphological unit that we are accustomed to call world history. That history which Goethe ended by despising the history of higher mankind during 6,000 years or so, without going into the deep problem of the inward homogeneity of all these aspects. What gives this fleeting form world meaning and substance, and what has hitherto lain buried deep under a mass of tangible facts and dates that has hardly yet been bored through, is the phenomenon of the great cultures. Only after these prime forms shall have been seen and felt and worked out in respect of their physiognomic meaning will it be possible to say that the essence and inner form of human history as opposed to the essence of nature are understood, or rather that we understand them. Only after this in-look and this outlook will a serious philosophy of history become feasible. Only then will it be possible to see each fact in the historical picture, each idea, art, war, personality, epoch, according to its symbolic content, and to regard history not as a mere sum of past things without intrinsic order or inner necessity, but as an organism of rigorous structure and significant articulation, an organism that does not suddenly dissolve into a formless and ambiguous future when it reaches the accidental present of the observer. Cultures are organisms. So in a way, they're a better term nowadays would be superorganisms. Cultures are a type of superorganism. Like Gaia is a superorganism. Cultures are organisms in world history as their collective biography. Morphologically, the immense history of the Chinese or of the classical culture is the exact equivalent of the petty history of the individual man, or of the animal, or the tree, or the flower. For the Faustian vision, this is not a postulate, but an experience. If we want to learn to recognize inward forms that constantly and everywhere repeat themselves, the comparative morphology of plants and animals has long ago given us the methods. And the destinies of the several cultures that follow upon one another, grow up with one another, touch, overshadow, and suppress one another, is compressed the whole content of human history. And if we set free their shapes, till now hidden all too deep under the surface of a trite history of human progress, and let them march past us in the spirit, it cannot but be that we shall succeed in distinguishing amidst all that is special or unessential the primitive culture form, the culture that underlies as ideal all the individual cultures. So in other words, he's going to do the same thing Goethe did when Goethe was looking at all plants and looking for the ultimate plant, the Erbpflanze. This is the culture, the anatomical structure, the skeleton through which all cultures pour themselves through these stages. I distinguish the idea of a culture, which is the sum total of its inner possibilities, from its sensible phenomenon or appearance upon the canvas of history as a fulfilled actuality. It is the relation of the soul to the living body, to its expression in the light world perceptible to our eyes. This history of a culture is the progressive actualizing of its possible, and the fulfillment is equivalent to the end. In this way, the Apollonian soul, which some of us can perhaps understand and share in, is related to its unfolding in the realm of actuality to the classical, or antique as we call it, of which the tangible and understandable relics are investigated by the archaeologist, the philologist, the aesthetic, and the historian. Culture is the prime phenomenon of all past and future world history. This is like Goethe's, the prime phenomenon of Goethe's Erbpflanze is the leaf. Every aspect of a plant is a transformed leaf in one way or another. The deep and scarcely appreciated idea of Goethe, which he discovered in his living nature and always made the basis of his morphological researches, we shall here apply, in its most precise sense, to all the formations of man's history, whether fully matured, cut off in the prime, half opened, or stifled in the seed. It is the method of living into the object, as opposed to dissecting it. The highest to which man can attain is wonder, and if the prime phenomenon makes him wonder, let him be content. Nothing higher can it give him, and nothing further should he seek for behind it. Here is the limit. It's a quote from Goethe. The prime phenomenon is that in which the idea of becoming is presented net. To the spiritual eye of Goethe, the idea of the prime plant was clearly visible in the form of every individual plant that happened to come up, or even that could possibly come up. In his investigation of the os intermaxillary, the intermaxillary bone, which Goethe discovered, which was thought to be absent in humans, but is present in all apes, was thought to be a borderline indicating that humans could not possibly have evolved from apes because we don't have this bone, this intermaxillary bone. Goethe found it. I don't know how he did it, but he found it and proved that it was there. So there's a continuum between us and the apes vis-a-vis his finding of the intermaxillary bone. His starting point with the intermaxillary bone was the prime phenomenon of the vertebrate type, and in other fields it was geological stratification, or the leaf as the prime form of the plant organism, or the metamorphosis of the plants as the prime form of all organic becoming. The same law will apply to everything else that lives, he wrote, in announcing his discovery to Herder. It was a look into the heart of things that Leibniz would have understood, but the century of Darwin is as remote from such a vision as it is possible to be. At present, however, we look in vain for any treatment of history that is entirely free from the methods of Darwinism, that is, of systematic natural science based on causality. A physiognomic that is precise, clear, and sure of itself and its limits has never yet arisen, and it can only arise through the discoveries of method that we have yet to make. Herein lies the great problem set for the 20th century to solve, to explore carefully the inner structure of the organic units through and in which world history fulfills itself, to separate the morphologically necessary from the accidental, and by seizing the purport of events, to ascertain the languages in which they speak. All right, we're coming up on this idea here of comparing civilizations to plants. Civilizations are like these giant, mighty trees that unfold, bloom, arise, flower, and then decay. That's his primary analogy. Now, the thing about this is, are civilizations really organisms? Are they really sort of giant plants with predetermined life cycles? The thing about this idea is that it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they behave enough like plants to justify the analogy. And I think that they do. So the analogy is justified whether they are in fact a species of gigantic superorganism or not. They behave enough like them to justify the analogy, and I think that's the key point. Subsection 7, a boundless mass of human being flowing in a stream without banks, upstream a dark past, wherein our time sense loses all powers of definition, and restless or uneasy fancy conjures up geological periods to hide away an eternally unsolvable riddle, downstream a future even so dark and timeless, such as the groundwork of the Faustian picture of human history. Over the expanse of the water passes the endless uniform wave train of the generations. Here and there bright shafts of light broaden out. This is Spengler at his best. I love when he gets poetic like this and he steps back and gives us a whole metaphysical picture of the civilization unfolding through time. Here and there bright shafts of light broaden out. Everywhere dancing flashes confuse and disturb the clear mirror, changing, sparkling, vanishing. These are what we call the clans, tribes, peoples, races, which unify a series of generations within this or that limited area of the historical surface. As widely as these differ in creative power, so widely do the images that they create vary in duration and plasticity. And when the creative power dies out, the physiognomic, linguistic, and spiritual identification marks vanish also, and the phenomenon subsides again into the ruck of the generations. Aryans, Mongols, Germans, Celts, Parthians, Franks, Carthaginians, Berbers, Bantus are names by which we specify some very heterogeneous images of this order. But over this surface, too, the great cultures accomplish their majestic wave cycles. They appear suddenly, swell in splendid lines, flatten again, and vanish, and the face of the waters is once more a sleeping waste. A culture is born in the moment when a great soul awakens out of the proto-spirituality. This is awesome, I love this shit. Of ever-childish humanity, and detaches itself, a form from the formless, a bounded and mortal thing from the boundless and enduring. It blooms on the soil of an exactly definable landscape, to which plant-wise it remains bound. It dies when this soul has actualized the full sum of its possibilities in the shape of peoples, languages, dogmas, arts, states, sciences, and reverts into the proto-soul. But its living existence, that sequence of great epochs which define and display the stages of fulfillment, is an inner passionate struggle to maintain the idea with a capital I, the idea, this is a Platonic form, the form of the civilization, against the powers of chaos without and the unconscious muttering deep down within. It is not only the artist who struggles against the resistance of the material and the stifling of the idea within him. Every culture stands in a deeply symbolical, almost in a mystical relation to the extended, the space, in which and through which it strives to actualize itself. The aim once attained, the idea, the entire content of inner possibilities, fulfilled and made externally actual, the culture suddenly hardens, it mortifies, its blood congeals, its force breaks down, and it becomes civilization. The thing which we feel and understand in the words Egypticism, Byzantinism, Mandaриnism. As such, they may, like a worn-out giant of the primeval forest, thrust their decaying branches towards the sky for hundreds or thousands of years, as we see in China, in India, in the Islamic world. These are sort of petrified giants. The Islamic world is a petrification of the Arabian, Magian world, as is India and China. They have survived their ossification period in a state of perpetual ossification. It was thus that the classical civilization rose gigantic in the imperial age with a false semblance of youth and strength and fullness, and robbed the young Arabian culture of the East of light and air. This, the inward and outward fulfillment, the finality that awaits every living culture, is the purport of all the historic declines, amongst them that decline of the classical, which we know so well and fully, and another decline, entirely comparable to it in course and duration, which will occupy the first centuries of the coming millennium, but is heralded already and sensible in and around us today, the decline of the West. Every culture passes through the age phases of the individual man. Each has its childhood, youth, manhood, and old age. It is a young and trembling soul, heavy with misgivings, that reveals itself in the morning of Romanesque and Gothic. It fills the Faustian landscape from the Provence of the troubadours to the Hildesheim Cathedral of Bishop Bernburg. The spring wind blows over it. In the works of the old German architecture, says Goethe, one sees the blossoming of an extraordinary state. Anyone immediately confronted with such a blossoming can do no more than wonder, but one who can see into the secret inner life of the plant and its reign of forces, who can observe how the bud expands, little by little, sees the thing with quite other eyes, and knows what he has seen. Childhood speaks to us also, and in the same tones, out of early Homeric Doric, out of early Christian, which is really early Arabian, art, and out of the works of the Old Kingdom in Egypt that began with the fourth dynasty, when the pyramids sprang up in the fourth dynasty. There, a mythic world consciousness is fighting like a harassed debtor against all the dark and demonic in itself and in nature, while slowly ripening itself for the pure day-bright expression of the existence that it will at last achieve and know. This is like Spengler writing Stoned. I can imagine him, because it's so poetic and visionary, I can imagine him taking little hashish cubes, which I don't think he did, he may have been a drinker. That's probably about as far as I would say for him, but I don't even know that for sure. But it's like he's taking hashish cubes and writing this. He's in a different state of consciousness here, totally. The more nearly a culture approaches the noon culmination of its being, the more virile, austere, controlled, intense the form language it has secured for itself. The more assured its sense of its own power, the clearer its lineaments. In the spring, all this had still been dim and confused, tentative, filled with childish yearning and fears. Witness the ornament of Romanesque Gothic church porches of Saxony and southern France, the early Christian catacombs, the de pylon vases. But there is now the full consciousness of ripened creative power that we see in the time of the early Middle Kingdom of Egypt, in the Athens of the Pisistratidae, in the age of Justinian, and that of the Counter-Reformation, and we find every individual trait of expression deliberate, strict, measured, marvelous in its ease and self-confidence. And we find, too, that everywhere, at moments, the coming fulfillment suggested itself. In such moments were created the head of a monument 3, this so-called Hexosphinx of Tanis, the domes of Hagia Sophia, the paintings of Titian, still later, tendered to the point of fragility, fragrant with the sweetness of late October days, come the Canidian Aphrodite and the Hall of the Maidens in the Erechtheum, the arabesques on Saracen horseshoe arches, the Zwinger of Dresden, Watteau, Mozart. At last, in the gray dawn of civilization, the fire in the soul dies down. So this is a portrait of the whole arc that he's given. In poetic version, the dwindling powers rise to one more half-successful effort of creation and produce the classicism that is common to all dying cultures. The soul thinks once again, and in Romanticism looks back piteously to its childhood, then finally, weary, reluctant, cold, it loses its desire to be, and, as in Imperial Rome, wishes itself out of the overlong daylight and back in the darkness of proto-mysticism, in the womb of the mother, in the grave. The spell of a second religiousness comes upon it, and late classical man turns to the practice of the cults of Mithras, of Isis, of the sun, those very cults into which a soul just born in the East has been pouring a new wine of dreams and fears and loneliness. Wonderful writing. That's the stuff in Spengler that I live for when he turns poetic like that. That's just fantastic stuff. All right, one more long passage, and then we're done with chapter 3. That was a beautiful passage, though. You have to admit, that's fantastic writing. I love Spengler's. He is a displaced poet, and keep in mind that he started as a dramatist. He was writing plays. There's still a surviving play of his called Montezuma that has not been translated. I'd love to read that then. So he's a frustrated playwright and poet, and so it didn't work for him. So he shifted into another medium entirely, and it worked. Same thing happened to me, actually. I was a frustrated science fiction writer. I was writing science fiction all through college and so forth. I couldn't ever get it to click right because I wanted it to be literary, and I thought that science fiction almost by definition meant pop culture. I could never get it to work right, so I switched gears into cultural criticism, and bam! I was writing with ease now. There was no struggle. It just came with ease. David Cronenberg had the same thing happen to him. He was a writer. His favorite novelists were Nabokov and Burroughs and Thomas Pynchon. And he wanted to be a novelist just like them. He couldn't get it to work, so he tried to switch gears to a totally different medium, cinema, which he knew nothing about, and bam, it clicked for him, and it worked. It was effortless. It's interesting how that happens. Plato, the same thing happened to Plato as well, and Joseph Campbell as well. Now, Mircea Eliade was an individual who managed to maintain both. He was able to write both fiction and prose all of his life, but I've never read any of his fiction, nor would I want to. No, thank you. I've seen Coppola's adaptation of one of his novels, Youth Without Youth, and it was totally awful. So, subsection 8. The term habit is used of a plant, habitus, is used of a plant to signify the special way proper to itself in which it manifests itself, i.e. the character, course, and duration of its appearance in the light world where we can see it. By its habit, each kind is distinguished in respect of each part and each phase of its existence from all examples of other species. We may apply this useful notion of habit in our physiognomic of the grand organisms and speak of the habit of the Indian, Egyptian, or classical culture, history, or spirituality. Some vague inkling of it has always, for that matter, underlain the notion of style, and we shall not be forcing, but merely clearing and deepening that word if we speak of the religious, intellectual, political, social, or economic style of a culture. This habit of existence in space, which covers, in the case of the individual man, action and thought and conduct and disposition, embraces in the case or the existence of whole cultures the totality of life expressions of the higher order, the choice of particular branches of art, e.g. the round and fresco by the Hellenes, counterpoint and oil painting by the West, and the out-and-out rejection of others, e.g. of plastic by the Arabs, inclination to the esoteric, India, or the popular, Greece and Rome, preference for oratory, classical, or for writing, China and the West, as the form of spiritual communication, are all style manifestations, and so also are the various types of costume, of administration, of transport, of social courtesies. All great personalities of the classical world form a self-contained group, whose spiritual habit is definitely different from that of all great men of the Arabian or the Western groups. Compare even Goethe and Raphael with classical men, and Heraclitus, Sophocles, Plato, Alcibiades, Themistocles, Horace, and Tiberius rank themselves together instantly as members of one family. It's curious that he puts in the Roman Emperor Tiberius here, who was known for his cruelty. I don't remember him being a writer at all. Every classical cosmopolis, from Hiro's Syracuse to imperial Rome, the embodiment and sense picture of one and the same life feeling, differs radically in layout and street plan, in the language of its public and private architecture, in the type of its squares, alleys, courts, facades, in its color, noises, street life and nightlife, from the group of Indian or that of Arabian or that of Western world cities. Let me turn off my Skype here so we don't get... I'm going to end up fighting Skype here for a minute. Hold on. Okay. All right. I think we're good. This is great, though. I like this passage. This is epic, Spengler. This is Spengler at his epic best. This huge sweep that he's able to see over all the historical forms. From the group of Indian or that of Arabian or that of Western world cities, Baghdad and Cairo could be felt in Grenada long after the conquest. Even Philip II's Madrid had all the physiognomic hallmarks of modern London and Paris. There is a high symbolism in every dissimilarity of this sort. Contrast the Western tendency to straight-lined perspectives and street alignments, such as the grand tract of the Champs-Élysées from the Louvre or the Piazza before St. Peter's, with the almost deliberate complexity and narrowness of the Via Sacra, the Forum Romanum, and the Acropolis, whose parts are arranged without symmetry and with no perspective. It's a little like the difference between the layout of Santa Fe, which is like that classical labyrinthine layout, and Phoenix, which is all rectilinear, straight line. You can look down a street in Phoenix and see depth perspective with a vanishing point going on forever. The streets just go on forever in one single straight line. Not so in Santa Fe. Even the town planning, whether darkly, as in the Gothic, or consciously, as in the ages of Alexander and Napoleon, reflects the same principle as the mathematic. In the one case, the Leibnizian mathematic of infinite space, in the other, the Euclidean mathematic of separate bodies. But to the habit of a group belong further its definite life duration and its definite tempo of development. Both of these are properties which we must not fail to take into account in a historical theory of structure. The rhythm of classical existence was different from that of Egyptian or Arabian, and we can fairly speak of the andante of Greek and Rome and the allegro con brio of the Faustian spirit. The notion of life duration as applied to a man, a butterfly, an oak, a blade of grass, comprises a specific time value, which is quite independent of all the accidents of the individual case. 10 years are a slice of life which is approximately equivalent for all men, and the metamorphosis of insects is associated with a number of days exactly known and predictable in individual cases. For the Romans, the notions of pueritia, adolescentia, inventus, virilitas, senectus, possessed an almost mathematically precise meaning. Without doubt, the biology of the future will, in opposition to Darwinism and to the exclusion in principle of causal fitness motives for the origins of species, take these preordained life durations as the starting point for a new enunciation of its problem. The duration of a generation, whatever may be its measure, is a fact of almost mystical significance. Now, such relations are valid also, and to an extent never hitherto imagined, for all the higher cultures. Every culture, every adolescence and maturing and decay of a culture, every one of its intrinsically necessary stages and periods has a definite duration, always the same, always recurring with the emphasis of a symbol. In the present work, we cannot attempt to open up this world of most mysterious connections, but the facts that will emerge again and again as we go on will tell us of themselves how much lies hidden here. What is the meaning of that striking 50-year period, the rhythm of the political, intellectual, and artistic becoming of all cultures, of the 300-year period of the Baroque, of the Ionic, of the great mathematics, of Attic sculpture, of mosaic painting, of counterpoint, of Galilean mechanics? What does the ideal life of 1 millennium for each culture mean in comparison with the individual man's 80 years and 10? As the plant's being is brought to expression in form, dress, and carriage by leaves, blossoms, twigs, and fruit, so also is the being of a culture manifested by its religious, intellectual, political, and economic formations. Just as, say, Goethe's individuality discourses of itself in such widely different forms as the Faust, the Farbenlehre, the Reineke Fuchs, Tasso, Werther, the Journey to Italy and the Friederike Love, the Westierliche Divan, and the Römische Elegan, so the individuality of the classical world displays itself in the Persian Moors, the Attic drama, the city-state, the Dionysia, and not less in the Tyrannus, the Ionic column, the geometry of Euclid, the Roman legion, and the gladiatorial contests and panem et circenses of the imperial age. In this sense, too, every individual being that has any sort of importance recapitulates of intrinsic necessity all the epochs of the culture in which it belongs. In each one of us, at that decisive moment when he begins to know that he is an ego, the inner life wakens just where and just how that of the culture wakened long ago. Each of us men of the West, in his child's daydreams and child's play, lives again its Gothic, the cathedrals, the castles, the hero sagas, the Crusaders du Laveau, the soul's oath of young Parzival. Every young Greek had his Homeric age and his marathon, and Goethe's Werther, the image of a tropic youth that every Faustian, but no classical man, knows. The springtime of Petrarch and the Minnesänger reappears. When Goethe blocked out the Urfaust, he was Parzival. When he finished Faust I, he was Hamlet. And only with Faust II did he become the world man of the 19th century who could understand Byron. Even the senility of the classical, the fatty and unfruitful centuries of very late Hellenism, the second childhood of a weary and blasé intelligence, can be studied in more than one of its grand old men. Thus, much of Euripides' Bacchae anticipates the life outlook, and much of Plato's Timaeus the religious syncretism of the imperial age, and Goethe's Faust II and Wagner's Parsifal disclose to us in advance the shape that our spirituality will assume in our next, in point of creative power, our last centuries. Biology employs the term homology of organs to signify morphological equivalence in contradistinction to the term analogy, which relates to functional equivalence. This important and, in the sequel, most fruitful notion was conceived by Goethe, who was led thereby to the discovery of the intermaxillary bone in man, and put into strict scientific shape by Owen, Richard Owen. This notion also we shall incorporate in our historic period, and that was, remember, the difference between a homology is when you have the same organ, and an analogy in biology is when you have two different organs performing the same function. For example, the lungs of a man are analogous to the gills of a fish because they perform the same function, breathing, respiration, whereas the lungs of a man are homologous with the swim bladder of a fish. Both perform different functions, but they're the same organ, transformed under different life conditions. That's homologous. The first one is analogous. So that Goethe made that distinction that Richard Owen inherited. It is known that for every part of the bone structure of the human head, an exactly corresponding part is found in all vertebrated animals, right down to the fish, and that the pectoral fins of a fish and the feet, wings, and hands of terrestrial vertebrates are homologous organs, even though they have lost every trace of similarity. Go over that again. The fins of a fish are homologous with the feet, wings, and hands of all terrestrial vertebrates. They're homologous organs, but they're transformed as the result of having to adapt to different landscapes. The lungs of terrestrial and the swim bladders of aquatic animals are homologous, as I just said, while lungs and gills, on the other hand, are analogous. Different organs, but they perform the same function. That is, similar in point of use. And the trained and deepened morphological insight that is required to establish such distinctions is an utterly different thing from the present method of historical research with its shallow comparisons of Christ and Buddha, Archimedes and Galileo, Caesar and Wallenstein, parceled Germany and parceled Greece. More and more clearly as we go on, we shall realize what immense views will offer themselves to the historical eye as soon as the rigorous morphological method has been understood and cultivated. To name but a few examples, homologous forms, homologous cultural forms now, applying that form of analogies, the special type of analogy called homology, to history now, we see classical sculpture and West European orchestration. Those are homologous forms. The Fourth Dynasty pyramids and the Gothic cathedrals, homologous forms. Indian Buddhism and Roman Stoicism. Buddhism and Christianity are not even analogs. The periods of the contending states in China, the Hyksos in Egypt, and the Punic Wars. And also I would add the World Wars. Those are all homological. The age of Pericles and the age of the Umayyads. The epochs of the Rig Veda, of Plotinus, and of Dante, and also Hesiod. And in Egypt, the pyramid texts. The Dionysiac movement is homologous with the Renaissance, analogous to the Reformation. For us, Wagner is the resume of modernity, as Nietzsche rightly saw, and the equivalent that logically must exist in the classical modernity we find in pergamony art. Remember that pergamony art, if you want to, you should Google it, look it up. It's spelled Pergamene. Look it up and get a glance at it. It's very dramatic, melodramatic, and full of bombast. It's very epic. It sets out to shock you. It's not classical anymore. It's Wagnerian in that sense. Some preliminary notion of the fruitlessness of this way of regarding history may be gathered from studying the tables included in this volume. The application of the homology principle to historical phenomena brings with it an entirely new connotation for the word contemporary. I designate as contemporary two historical facts that occur in exactly the same relative position in their respective cultures on the timelines, and therefore possess exactly equivalent importance. It has already been shown how the development of the classical and that of the Western mathematic proceeded in complete congruence, and we might have ventured to describe Pythagoras as the contemporary of Descartes, Archytas of Laplace, Archimedes of Gauss. The Ionic and the Baroque again ran their course contemporaneously. Polygnotus pairs in time with Rembrandt, Polycletus with Bach. The Reformation, Puritanism, and above all, the turn to civilization appear simultaneously in all cultures. In the classical, this last epoch bears the names of Philip and Alexander. In our West, those of the Revolution and Napoleon. Contemporary, too, are the building of Alexandria, of Baghdad, and of Washington. Classical coinage and our double-entry bookkeeping, the first Tyrannus and the Fronde, Augustus and Shiwangi, Hannibal and the World War. Hannibal corresponds to Hitler, by the way, in this sense. He comes back again, First World War, Second World War, and then we have Hannibal in the First Punic War and the Second, also in the Second, in an even bigger, more epic battle. I hope to show that without exception, all great creations and forms in religion, art, politics, social life, economy, and science appear, fulfill themselves, and die down contemporaneously in all the cultures. That the inner structure of one corresponds strictly with that of all the others, that there is not a single phenomenon of deep physiognomic importance in the record of one for which we could not find a counterpart in the record of every other, and that this counterpart is to be found under a characteristic form and in a perfectly definite chronological position. At the same time, if we are to grasp such homologies of facts, we shall need to have a far deeper insight and a far more critical attitude towards the visible foreground of things than historians have hitherto been wont to display. Who amongst them, for instance, would have allowed himself to dream that the counterpart of Protestantism was to be found in the Dionysiac movement, and that English Puritanism was for the West what Islam was for the Arabian world? Seen from this angle, history offers possibilities far beyond the ambitions of all previous research, which has contented itself in the main with arranging the facts of the past so far as these were known, and that according to a one-line scheme. The possibilities, namely, of overpassing the present as a research limit and predetermining the spiritual form, duration, rhythm, meaning, and product of the still unaccomplished stages of our Western history, and reconstructing long-vanished and unknown epochs, even whole cultures of the past, by means of morphological connections, in much the same way as modern paleontology deduces far-reaching and trustworthy conclusions as to skeletal structure and species from a single unearthed skull fragment. I think it was Cuvier who said that he could pick up a bone and reconstruct the entire organism from one bone. Because of this morphological idea, he would know what the rest of the organism would be like. That's what Spengler's trying to convey here. You only need to know a certain amount of history, and then you can slot around it what the morphology is going to be. This applies especially for figuring out Mesoamerica, which hadn't really, the ruins of which had not yet really come in yet at this time. And finally, one last paragraph here. It is possible, given the physiognomic rhythm, to recover from scattered details of ornament, building, script, or from odd political, economic, and religious data, the organic characters of whole centuries of history, and from known elements on the scale of art expression to find corresponding elements on the scale of political forms, or from that of mathematical forms to read that of economic. This is a truly Goethean method, rooted in fact in Goethe's conception of the prime phenomenon, which is already to a limited extent current in comparative zoology, but can be extended to a degree hitherto undreamed of over the whole field of history. Wow, that was quite a haul there. That was pretty epic writing. Some of the best writing I think we've seen yet so far. So we're 113 pages in. We've finished chapter 3. We're on the threshold of chapter 4, the problem of world history 2, the idea of destiny and the principle of causality. It's one of my favorite chapters, so we'll get to that next.